Welcome to the latest edition of the Mind-Gut Conversation podcast, a place to learn about breakthroughs in the science and practice of health, mind-body interactions, the microbiome, food, and the environment. Today, I have the great pleasure to talk to Raja Dhir, co-founder and co-CEO of Seed Health, a microbial sciences company pioneering applications of bacteria to impact human and environmental health. Raja is not only co-CEO of Seed Health, but he serves on the editorial board for the journal Microbiome. He is a member of the Microbiome Think Tank at the Mass General Hospital at Harvard and sits on the Advisory Committee of ISAPP, the International Scientific Association of Probiotics and Prebiotics. Welcome to the show, Raja. Yeah, so let's start with an area that some skeptics of probiotics might bring up. Fermented foods, which do not necessarily contain probiotics as we define them today, have been around for thousands of years, not for health reasons, but for the purpose of preserving food and allowing humans to migrate and to go to distant places without fresh food available. And then there's also, so coming back to these naturally fermented foods, a recent study that has shown that comparing high fiber with a diet high in naturally fermented foods would actually have some benefits in terms of inflammatory markers and microbial diversity. It's obviously a small study. I'm sure it was even surprising to the investigators that it came out this way, but it certainly would ask the question, if there is these naturally fermented foods, why do we need probiotic supplements?
And I think it's a good question, but the history of fermentation also teaches us a lot. So you're absolutely right. Fermentation was used for preservation. It helped people travel to longer distances. It even helped keep food fresh, even in places that we think of very healthy diets like the Mediterranean or a slightly modified Mediterranean diet. You find a lot of microbial cultures that are used for the processing of dairy, as well as the preservations of foods and even some meats. Now, just because something I think is fermented doesn't necessarily make it good. I think otherwise you could make a very self-serving rationalization for why wine and beer could be considered a health-promoting food, and I don't think that that's either fair either. Probiotics, by definition, have to be an organism that's inducing a health effect in a host. And so I think what we're touching on is in many ways the incorrect use of the term probiotics to describe anything which is a fermented or any product which contains microorganisms. I love fermented foods. I consume them, and I think most cultures have some element of consumption of foods that have been treated or involved with microbes in some capacity. I don't necessarily know that that means you can A, generalize that all fermented foods would be beneficial, or B, that there's not some negative effects or some downsides to the act of fermentation. And I'll give you a perfect example. So one study that came out about 2 years ago was spun by the media. It was done actually, I think in Los Angeles at UCLA, as the fact that fermented teas induce a very positive effect. You can see a massive uprising of organic acids, short-chain fatty acids, and a lot of these metabolites, right? A lot of these post-fermentative metabolites, which are believed to have the beneficial effect. Now, that sounds very promising. But remember, if you go back and then look at the charts, you're seeing that with every increase of a secondary metabolite, you're also seeing a total crash of the precursors. So all of these elagitanins, these catechins, these tea-based compounds, which are also beneficial for us, I don't know. I don't think that we can say that, is it better that you deprive your gut of the fermentative activity and that could produce something more interesting? Or do you let that activity happen outside of it, and then you consume it after the fermentation act has happened? So there's another side to this story that yes, you're producing something, but it always comes at a cost because these elements need to have precursors for their fermentation to have. That's the first question I would really pose. I don't know where the literature is going to land on that, but the fact that prebiotic foods, so before the act of fermentation, give your body the opportunity to convert it, and your native organisms to convert these things into very interesting compounds is something that I would encourage us all to think about. Now, the second part of your question was on the recent study that came out showing a downregulation of inflammatory markers. I think that having an microbial introduction, and this isn't about what's in your microbiome. Your microbiome, most of these organisms are already in your colon, and there's very little signaling with the passage of the microbes through the body's gastrointestinal tract from your native microbiome. So that's another very important point we want to remember, is transient introduction and microbial exposure generally all in is probably good. And this could come from the form of a little bit of dirt on your foods. It could come in the form of a fermented food. It could come in the form of a probiotic that's in a capsule. Now, what makes what I think the next generation or very specific true probiotics very distinctive is that a lot of these organisms are native to the human ecology. So they're either isolated, they derive, or they take up some ecological role within the human body. And so comparing the microbial exposure that you're going to get from a fermentative product, which is the goal of it is to actually acidify more than anything else, with an organism which can interact with dendritic cells to induce a very powerful immunological response, it's just very different. It's totally different. Now, the whole wave of the probiotics industry until very recently was actually just taking starter cultures that are used in fermentative foods and trying to stabilize them and offer them as supplements. And so I can't say that I fully agree with this. Or actually, I can't say that I can make a case that this is any better than effect that you could have from the consumption of a fermented food. I think that the publication that you're speaking about had a couple of deficiencies in that I don't think that we saw much of a shift in the microbiome. But when you do look at these broad inflammatory markers, you can start to see things go up and things go down. But it's very, the immune system is very complex. I think it's very hard to generalize with certainty that the effects that we're seeing, I think it's encouraging, but I don't think it's a smoking gun, because you can't say, with definition, okay, in some instances of duress, having elevated immune markers sometimes is good, sometimes it's bad. And so I think that anybody who's the one drawback of the study is that I think that it was a little bit light on the hardcore immunology. I think that for what we can deduce from a microbiology standpoint, it was a well-powered study. And of course, the group itself is very well recognized. And so the methods were very strong. Most promising, I think, is that now it gives us an opportunity to say, these are the types of things we need to validate on types of fermented foods, also to make sure that there's some fermented foods that some people can't tolerate. The more we advance, the more we understand about this field, the more we'll get specificity. For some people, you don't actually want a histamine-inducing fermentative microbe that you might find in a food, but you might want something which is, produces a D-lactate instead of L-lactate, or you might want something which is a very defined effect. So we're just in the early stages of what I call the real frontier of probiotics, and trying to understand what they are, why you're going to take them, what they're going to do, whether they're compatible with food, do they survive the gastrointestinal system, do they colonize, how do they interact with the immune system, and then long-term, do they displace or do they have any off-target effects on your existing microbiome? And this is why I say, unless probiotics have a culture or a pedigree of the right type of randomization and controlled data across a multitude, nothing's going to answer all these questions day one. But this is the types of questions we need to say to the skeptics, whether this probiotic could be beneficial or whether it couldn't. And I'll give you one just final example on this question. So a lot of people hear about this concept of a leaky gut, right? I don't like the term. I think it's very poorly defined. I think that actually sometimes gastrointestinal permeability, to give the body's immune system a taste of what's happening in the environment around it, might actually be beneficial, or might actually be part of a conserved immunological response, that the way that the immune system can get some information on what's happening outside. But net, high levels of bacterial, microbial, or post-fermentative translocation into the body is not really a good thing, especially when you're getting like C-react, the things that induce a reactivity response, like the cell wall membrane, for example, of a gram-negative bacteria. So we do know now that this would generally be a positive effect. If you could take a cocktail of organisms, and this, remember, this is not going to happen from the bugs in your microbiome. This is going to happen from the ingestion of bacteria. If you could induce something, and this induction could be glutamine, glutamine has a very similar effect. It could be a live organism. It could be an amino acid, another amino acid. But microbes are very good at this kind of controlled chaos, this type of the promotion of tolerance. So they'll go in there, they're actually harmless, but they'll activate the body's gastroepithelial cells to induce this type of effect that overall increases the fidelity, the space, and tightens up the junction space between cells in the gut. To the extent that somebody is seeking or would benefit from that type of an outcome, I would say, okay, the right probiotic that has demonstrated this type of an effect could be very beneficial. And we're just at the very beginning. There's studies that we're designing right now that are actually looking at host transcriptomics. So they're actually putting a brush deep down the gastrointestinal system and brush sampling the systems of the cells of the small intestines, and they're seeing what transcriptional changes are happening in the host after exposure to a broad spectrum cocktail of bacteria. And so, again, I don't want to be over biased about what we've developed, but in general, there's some themes here which are very interesting. You want to make sure that you understand that the cells are alive. Otherwise, it's not doing anything at all. It's a placebo. You want to make sure that you're having the right type of effect on the intestinal cells in the gut. That's the type of work that we're doing. And lastly, you want to have a very, very broad sampling, a consortia, right? Any single one microbe is probably limited in what it could do. But you want to have this concept of functional redundancy, which you do get in fermented foods, by the way. So you want to have multiple organisms of multiple strains within the same species that donate different contributions to the activity of that species. And I think that that's really important to where this field's going to go.
Yeah, I mean, this is obviously really exciting. I'm totally on the same wavelength with you, and for these reasons have long been a skeptic, not just of probiotics specifically, but about a lot of the supplements. And I was going to ask you about this. Is it the way this field has evolved? You look at websites, you look at Google, and there's hundreds of claims and about health promoting properties of this strain and the five best probiotics, and it's not just on the internet. There's also review articles written by gastroenterologists about this, and it's sort of become my opinion that in general, the consumer doesn't even need anymore, can't even differentiate anymore if there's a real science behind it, because like all these questions that you addressed for the consumer already answered. The leaky gut is already, you don't need to do any further studies. They are convinced, they know what that is, and what causes it and what prevents it. And so this is a big concern that I have. Does it at this stage of the game, does it still need these controlled evidence-based scientific approaches that seed is taking, or is it now just the influencers, the number of followers that they have, and the power of influencers that can drive the field?
I'm very encouraged that a small but growing percentage of people are starting to become more scientifically literate. I think that science is very intimidating to people that don't get it, and the communication style of the influencers or people that even have a commercial interest in some products is a lot easier to understand, right? The things that make a New York Times bestseller oftentimes is not the most technical or the most dense, and that's a issue that the whole field of science has to address at some point or another, or it's not just restricted to our field. I think that one technique which has empowered people a lot from my experience is to teach them the right questions to ask. Because when you can equip somebody as a question asker with the right questions and then teach them what to look for in the right answer versus what's wrong, they don't actually have to understand everything in the answer, but they can start to understand just whether it exists or whether the evidence base doesn't exist, right? If it's real or if it's a manipulation. The thing is, when products are being marketed so far ahead of the data, you know, it takes advantage of people's desire. Almost it's a manipulation of somebody's desperation to say, well, I suffer with anxiety, I suffer with stress, so maybe I should take something that markets itself as a gut-brain axis product or a mood regulating probiotic, despite the fact that if you go to the initial clinical trial, it didn't meet its primary endpoint. The primary endpoint was to have a change in the stress response. And so they pick out a third or a fourth endpoint, and then they use it and spin it to kind of be like a positive trial. And they do it for marketing claims so they don't get sued or they don't get shut down by the FTC more than they actually do it for the education to consumers. So, for example, I don't think a lactobacillus or a bifidobacterium, which are common probiotic organisms, are organisms that will deeply have an effect on your mood. Is just not known. And someone who is skilled in the art knows that the mechanisms of action that your microbiome works to regulate your state of mind is deeply involved. Okay, the vagus nerve is not a single nerve, but it's involved in very mild signaling. And actually, the vagus nerve isn't play a big role in that. That's more on immediate responses, right? It's more on fight or flight type of things. It's not involved in these long-term complex patterns of cognition. For those, you really want to have the absence of a stressor. So that's where some of these newer mechanisms are possible, where they say, okay, well, this bug makes GABA, or this bug work on the barrier a little bit, or this bug reduce total circulating cortisol levels in the evening. In the morning, you want cortisol. In the evening, you don't, right? So that's one thing. The second is that the field is in its early stages, and so we don't have probiotics for weight. We don't have probiotics for your for the gut-brain axis. We don't really have it even for cardiovascular, although I have seen some compelling data that we even build into our compositions on the reduction of low and very low density lipoproteins for cholesterol. So it's very specialized, and even that I wouldn't say works on triglycerides. So it's a very specialized field. What I will say that the data is pretty interesting. It's still day one, but it's going to get better, is if somebody suffers from non-specific digestive distress upon the consumption of foods or related to the intake of foods, and this can present itself in some mild forms of IBS. In some instances, it can present itself in some serious clinical manifestations, but mostly it's low number of weekly bowel movements. It's inability to have a clean evacuation. It's straining and force. It's production of different gases. It's this type of generalized malaise. And even then, the responder rate with even the best probiotic composition, which I believe is the one that we've assembled, is probably still only 7 out of 10, right? So you have to take these things really scientifically, and you have to, there's anybody, even if the future of probiotics 10 years from now gets invented from the absolute best microbiome research that exists in the world today, the same thing's not really going to work for everyone all of the time. That's why we take the concept that we take for this existing product. It's a highly redundant, highly complementary species and strain additional consortia. So the things that work for different people, it maximizes the opportunity that there's going to be a positive effect in some way. You have a better chance that the most number of people will have a high hit. Any other concept today, I would be shocked if it has more than a 30-40% response rate, and that's with the best products on the market today.
Yeah, I was actually going to ask you, this is from the next question. I mean, obviously we're all very different in terms of the strain composition in our microbiome. You know, you claim that only 10% is really shared between individuals, much less than in terms of your genetics. And so, you know, some people would say personalization of any treatment, supplements, probiotics is essential if you really want to have maximal impact. So what you're explaining is with having a redundant mix of microbes and pathways that gets around this. So some people may benefit from one aspect but not from the other.
It's a very interesting question. Now, personalization is kind of a dirty word because everybody says it to try to create space between them and other people that's involved in the field. It's a very interesting way to set yourself up. You create a big promise. You say, okay, we're going to do something that's based for you. Typically, when you hear somebody talk about personalization, you hear about a questionnaire or a blood test or a stool sample. And what this does is it kind of creates this effect that, okay, well, based on the information that I'm giving these people, they're going to give something back to me that's based only for me. Now, it's a great idea. How well can we execute on this idea as a scientific and industrial community, I think is a lot more challenging. Now, I don't think I found a truly scientifically validated basis for personalization, which have the computational, bioinformatics, and statistical power to support those insights today. And that's not to be critical of other companies. That's to say that we need to change our expectations. You can't ideate something like this and then just thinking about it can't make it real. You can wish for this concept to be real all you want, but the truth of the matter is, to arrive at a true sense of personalization, you need years and years of patient data across a very large cohort. So I think on average, you need about 20 or 30,000 years of patient data. You need unique data points. So you don't just need a stool sample, but you need to do blood metabolomics. You need to have a nutrition log over a long period of time. You need to integrate their genetics. You need to factor in their age. You need to factor in their family environment and life. And then you need to do both temporal, but also longitudinal sampling. So you can't just do it at one time point and say, okay, good, we got our 20,000 patient years, but you have to track the same people over a long period of time. We're doing a project like this right now that's going over 20 years, and we're in the 5th year of this. And it's why you'll never hear us as a company talk about personalization until we have the data. We just don't have it. When you have the data, this is a very nice idea. And even then, by the way, it's not going to be as magical. And again, not to digress into more of a philosophical point, but I think that especially Americans, we're brought up to think that from a very young age, that we're a very individualistic country. And so we think about, and I don't mean this in a bad way, but the world really does, like Copernicus, it's a very heliocentric. The world revolves around the individual and around us. And so we like these stories that are personalized and they're trained to us. And I think that they have some power, but we're nowhere near the power that we need to properly understand. Right now, we're kind of in the first inning of this level of personalization. Now, the second part, and this is very, very important, there's a bit of a myth that because everybody has a different microbiome, that the same intervention cannot work across a wide population. Okay, so it's a bit two ships passing in the night. Yes, it's true that everybody has a very different microbiome taxonomically, but we have this obsession with taxonomy. So we try to say, okay, or these are the genes that are being expressed, or these are the organisms that are present, or this is the relative abundance between different things. And so we make this fingerprint, and then we have an obsession that because we have this special fingerprint, you can't possibly have the same thing that works for everybody. Now, it depends what the indication is. I would point the conversation to a study that was done, and I use this study very often, actually 2 studies, and because we started with the gut-brain axis, we'll keep on this line of thinking. So a few years ago, a group in Belgium looked at a Flemish cohort, about 1,000 people, to see that had a major depressive disorder. And in this case, they wanted to see what is the microbiome and its input, and could we use this data to maybe build the future of probiotics and understand the contribution. Actually, they weren't even thinking about the intervention. They're trying to think, can we understand what in the microbiome is actually driving depression, clinical symptoms of depression? And they found something very interesting. they found that even after adjusting for the use of antidepressants, that two species of gut bacteria across the entire cohort were more or less deficient, right? It was I don't remember actually, Coprococcus and Dialister. And so this is very fascinating. I mean, this is one of the first real evidence that says that you can actually cluster people by indication, not by just their starting baseline microbiome. So could everybody that has symptoms of depression, or could a very high percentage of people benefit from the same intervention despite having radically different microbiomes? Maybe. And now this is the type of evidence that makes basic scientists very excited. Another study that came out last year in Science Translational Medicine was looking actually at the gut microbiome. And they said that the gut microbiome can only predict about 60%, if you just go blind, right? 60% of the cases of people that have major depressive disorder. And so remember, this is very nice. You're starting to find multiple groups all over the world start to interrogate the same thing from very different ways and then share their findings. And this is what makes science beautiful. They found that 60% or so you could tell by looking at the composition of the gut microbiome, regardless of which analysis you ran. If you're looking at metabolism, if you're looking at transcriptomics, if you're looking at just deep read metagenomics, 60%. But when you start to factor in the metabolites that's found in the blood and the metabolites that's found in the urine, you increase the predictive power to 95+%. So it really shows that you have to consider the entire host, and you have to look not just at what's in your gut, but you really over a long period of time have to understand. And remember, this is just to predict. And for me, even as from a basic science perspective, that's very powerful. So now we can round the corner and say, okay, so phase one of science is to build beautiful techniques to understand what's happening. Most companies that do personalization, they launch before they even have techniques to properly analyze what's happening. Phase two is you have to then consider all of the different inputs and become predictive. Can you predict? Can someone give me a sample, and can I tell them information about them that's unique to that individual, that's not generalized, but that's unique for the condition of interest? That's phase two. And then phase three is that you have to then use all those insights to build an intervention and test those in a randomized controlled trial. Now, to take it back to how we started this conversation, if you teach people these simple sequence of events of questioning, you start to make very powerful consumers. And these very powerful consumers can start to hold industry accountable. And when industry is held accountable, it's no longer profitable to launch something that's telling the promise of the fourth phase at day one. And this is that circle. This is that diagram you have to really look at before you can get to personalization.
I mean, consumer education clearly is one thing that's badly missing, and academia has really missed the boat on this. You know, it's not. I see it all the time when I talk to my junior colleagues. You know, are they interested in starting a podcast or actually getting out with the social media to the lay public with messages that the consumer understands? And most of them are not interested because they don't have time. You know, they have to write grants and write papers. It's not something that the university, so you don't get promoted because you have 100,000 followers, you know, with a scientifically or evidence-based content. So this is a problem. And then you have on the other side, you have a lot of people have a lot of time to focus whole armies of social media experts on promoting messages that are not, you know, not based on answers to the right questions. So yeah, it's going to be interesting how this will evolve. I mean, I certainly been really impressed by what Seed is doing in that area, and then how you guys approach it. Hopefully this will make a dent on the current field, you know, where it's sort of the Wild West. I mean, whatever you can put out there, and you know, you have the loudest voice, that's the winner. You know, it's not.
It's the loudest voice, but also this is again it's a classical problem in science at large, which is you can usually go through the literature and find something to support the position you want to take. And, one of the things I spent a lot of my early life in was I was a highly competitive debater, and this idea of switch side debate. So you make a very compelling case and you lead somebody to one conclusion, then you hop to the other side and you actually make the exact opposite case. And a good debater or a good orator and communicator is able to kind of do this on either side. Now, you want to ultimately also get to a point where you're seeking what's true, right? Not just what sounds right, or not just what's believable. I mean, look what we did with fermented foods. If I wanted to make a case for fermented foods being super protective, I could go and I could start to correlate different immune markers that came out of this study and different totally disparate effects that those markers when they're elevated have on different chronic diseases, and start to stack and layer a very complex case for how this is going to reduce your risk of chronic disease, stop you from getting cancer, prevent neurodegeneration, just all based off of a cytokine. But we know that the body doesn't work that way. The other side of it is that, okay, like here's a perfect example, okay? So everybody in the microbiome field is absolutely fascinated with this bacteria called Akkermansia. It's a bacteria which lives very close to the gut mucosa, and it's been associated and shown to actually reverse a lot of, to be involved in obesity, type 2 diabetes, weight gain, right? And so a lot of people early on in the field said, okay, hey, this is very interesting. Maybe we can give people Akkermansia and we can solve obesity. Okay, you start to see the problem here. Now, if you use correlation, Akkermansia is also correlated and extremely elevated in people that get Alzheimer's disease and Parkinson's. Extremely. Why? We just don't know. Now, if I wanted to make a case, see, this is why in science communication, conspiracy theories and fear actually work a lot better than hope, because you can make a huge case why if you take this Akkermansia, or if you do this, or if you have it, then you're going to start to totally increase your chance of having neurodegeneration later in life. But we don't know that. We don't know. Maybe it's the other way around. Maybe the gut mucosa becomes weak when people start to get neurodegeneration, which allows these mucosal organisms to enrich. They feast. They go and they have all the mucosal lining that they want to eat, and they just latch onto the secretor cells, and they actually start to degrade that, and that creates a feedback loop which allows the translocation of another bacteria, and then the cell wall of that bacteria crosses the blood-brain barrier, and that starts to induce amyloid plaque formation. We just don't know, right? So, but to stay on topic to your point, I think we need to start to bring the few people in our field that are good at this. One person that comes to mind when it comes to neurology or neuroscience and ophthalmology is Andrew Huberman at Stanford, who is absolutely killing it with his podcast and making science and science-based techniques accessible to everybody. And so inviting people like that on for these dynamic conversational, they don't feel like a lecture. They don't feel like it's a chore that you have to force yourself to get educated, but let's use these techniques that make conspiracy theories so sticky, right? Let's use debate, let's use argumentation, let's use provocation, let's challenge concept, let's find things that are really actionable, and then let's get out of our own biases. And there's very few people that are hard academics that I think have done that really well. Andrew comes to mind. I mean, I think you should invite him on to your podcasts, and we should find more people like that, which have diverse, broad knowledge without any particular case or self-confirming bias, right? And by the way, this is not something that's unique to product marketing. Let's stay with neurology because, again, we're on the theme, but the amyloid plaque hypothesis for Alzheimer's disease is the most amazing example of actually the scientific establishment rejecting all this new information that would change the way they think, because they built their entire career on this idea that amyloid is dangerous, amyloid is bad. Why is it conserved in everything from a fruit fly and a simple worm all the way to humans then? Because it's a primitive immune response in the brain. And we have to start thinking differently about these ideas. And even academia, actually, especially academia, has to be also part of this group that's willing to admit when we don't know something. We're going to wait to see when more stuff comes out, and stay tuned and watch this space. So I think both sides need to kind of check their corrective biases at the door when they walk in. And the more space and the more people that we can create that have these type of discussions and we amplify it, I think that's better for the whole field.
Yeah, I mean, the thing in academia, coming just back to this, one of the reasons for this conservative trend that's existing there is that's how you get your grants. If you propose something that's against all the the work of your reviewers and your review panel, you never got this grant. You have to build it on this conservative body of knowledge. And so I mean, I've been lucky being on this U19 NIH consortium on Alzheimer's disease out of Duke, and that's an example. It's amazing, these 30 plus participants from Europe and the US, the discussion that happened there about the potential role of the microbes and the metabolites and the interaction with brain systems. So that's a good example of how, but then this doesn't go out to the lay public. This is sort of this exclusive club of experts that it's amazingly illuminating to listen to this, but it doesn't necessarily go out to the public. I think that's really the.
And again, I mean, you see examples of this all the time. People think that science is an establishment. You see it with SARS-CoV-2. In the beginning, the scientific community didn't get masks right 100% and equipment. They didn't really get the mode of transmission of the microbe right, whether it's aerosolized, whether it's not, whether it's hand-to-face contact. They actually really missed out the lethality of it because they got the denominator wrong. So at some points in the early stages of pandemic, some people were saying it's 5%, 6% fatal. And when very prominent people like Johnny Ioannidis, who's is a hero of mine, he's a statistician, one of the best in the world, he's also at Stanford, came out of this, he got dragged through the mud by scientists and non-scientists alike, because even scientists, they thought, okay, no, let's just take the message which helps us control the behavior of people, because they're thinking from a public health perspective. But they weren't thinking what helps people trust the scientific process long term. And you see constant examples of this, because why? At the end of the day, humans are ultimately these highly emotional, confirmation-seeking, self-interest driven human beings. And the sooner we stop repressing that and start actually thinking about how we can use that vulnerability to be better scientific communicators, I think really everybody's going to be in better shape. And so then when of course something gets proven wrong, they just brush it under the rug and say, oh, well, that's part of the scientific process. Well, you have to say that at the beginning. That's part, if you want the trust, you have to earn it. And part of earning it is at the beginning, you have to say, this is what we think right now.
Yeah. So it's, yeah, let me ask you another question. So we talked about academia and, and the public. So despite the continuing and really impressive growth of the probiotic market, there's there's a divide, really, I would say, between. So when I go to one of our noon lectures and talk about probiotics, it's not uncommon that colleagues, senior colleagues, and junior colleagues would say, "But do you really believe probiotics do anything?" As opposed to the uncritical enthusiasm by the public. So there's still a skepticism amongst the medical establishment that probiotics are really that essential. And so in the medical system or in our gastroenterology meetings, it's talking about specific diseases, not general well-being or general gut health.
Yeah.
Do you think this divide is going to disappear over time with the kind of studies that you're talking about?
100%. I mean, look, academics are, having said everything that I just said, data is the great equalizer. And so you can hype all you want, but at the end of the day, the data have to be there. So asking if probiotics really work or if probiotics are really good is a very generic question. It's like asking if books are good or if governments are good. I mean, okay, a dictator obviously is not, dictatorship's not good, as well as a government that's running on corruption or an oligarchy with private interests also isn't good. But there's also some instances where they are very protective because they do have an effect on the desired, in this case, probably stability and predictability of rule of law. And so the endpoint makes the recommendation. Are probiotics good for diverticulitis? Probably not. Maybe there's one that works, and sometimes they probably make it worse. Is probiotics good for Crohn's disease? Probably there's not enough evidence to say yes. There's certainly not enough evidence to say that all probiotics or anything marketing itself as a probiotic is. But do I think that there is a component that of microbial exposure which can deeply and persistently correct the localized inflammatory cascade that's involved in gastrointestinal inflammatory disorders? I think it's so. And we know there's a mechanism for it. Now it's just about finding the right bugs. We know that microbes can single-handedly communicate to a wide range of immune cells locally that then have distal effects that circulate across the whole body, that I've seen cases of FMT, right? If an FMT works, then of course a probiotic is possible. A probiotic is just a more rationally defined version of a microbial cocktail. So if an FMT works on reversing food allergies, or if it works on people with eczema, or if it's working on people that have a C. diff infection, or even some Crohn's disease, I think it's a very imprecise tool. But for me, the fact that FMT works, or at least has been efficacious, is a point of no return to say probiotics can work. Maybe the ones on the market today don't, or maybe a very small fraction of them do and the rest of them don't. But the mechanism is there, and the microbes are there just waiting to be uncovered, stabilized, scaled up, and delivered to where they need to go.
I'm staying with the topic of FMT. I mean, as you mentioned, so it clearly well established that it works in C. difficile colitis, and that's probably the only entity, diagnostic entity, where it's generally accepted that it's efficacious. I think all the other attempts in, there's small studies in IBS and in IBD and obesity, none of them would really hold up, and they've not been replicated. Sometimes it was found that, yes, in IBS study, really interesting study, that you could actually change the microbial, relative abundances, but patients got worse on this. So this is actually an argument that a lot of people have been using. Why doesn't FMT work in more indications? And I mean, obviously FMT is not being used in the situation where somebody has what's called a poor gut health in general, not a specific diagnosis. So we don't know that, what it would do there.
But I want to comment on that, Imran. Like, FMT as it is today, it's a shock that it works 90+% in C. diff infection. But it makes sense, because in a C. diff infection, the whole ecology is wrong. Yes. So a transplantation of a random ecology, even if you have no rational inclusion whatsoever, is efficacious, right? So we're involved now in studies where we're actually doing more rationally defined FMTs. So let's say on the back end of a computational program or technique that tells us these genes are really important for signaling from the gut to downregulating inflammation on the skin. Let's say that someone has atopic dermatitis. So you don't just want to take anybody's stool from the street, but that's how FMTs are today, is they literally, actually, I have a funny story about this. 5 years ago, I went through the screening process just for self-interest and curiosity to become a donor. And I was approved in less than a day. Okay, there's no rationale. This was the early days of infection. They had emergency use authorization for C. diff. This is not FMT. Now, you need to find the host. Who the host is extremely important, or the donor, I should say, for validating FMT. But when the donor has been rationally defined, and there is a very good bioinformatics pipeline to support why you're looking for the donor, who the donor is, and what you're donating, you start to see a very different story, a very, very different story. And so I don't want to let, a very easy way for people to think about this is that if it's an ecological problem, any healthy ecology can work. But if the problem is in the host, you need to consider the microbes, the host from the microbes that were considered, because it's a microbe host interaction. And I think a lot of times we get a bit too caught up with the microbes and we start to forget a bit about too much about the host.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, certainly once that challenge of FMT has been overcome, it will open up a huge field, obviously, in medicine. Not necessarily in fecal transplant, but in the modern equivalent of that.
And that's exactly what we're doing right now. We're building pipelines for aging, atopic dermatitis, type 2 diabetes, cardiovascular disease, obesity, and body mass. I mean, we're now building, but to do this, you need all the right data, you need the right strains, you need the right isolation techniques, you need the right cultivation techniques, but that's what we're doing. And so it's not an overnight thing. This is still going to be 3-4 years away, but the future is here. I mean, I can tell you a little bit, like I can't go into too much detail, but I can tell you when it comes to atopic dermatitis and skin diseases, there's some people in microbiome that are putting microbes on the face. There's some that are trying to do FMT non-specific. We're trying to do rationally defined gut microbiome transplantation from hosts of interest with a very deep bioinformatics pipeline. And I can tell you that right now, it looks like it's going to work.
Yeah, this is exciting. Can't wait to see the results of that. So this is clearly, from listening to you, a very different approach that you guys have been taking, you as the co-CEO scientifically, than I would say all other companies that are currently in that space. But what's been fascinating to me, that in addition to this song of transparency and evidence-based and science-based, I find it intriguing that your research and your efforts don't really stop at the human gut. I mean, so there's a whole part of the company or a second company affiliated with Seed that goes after the microbes, or the microbiome in the soil and with plants and with animals. Could you expand on that a little bit more?
Yeah, well, look, the dream of any founder is to build a type of company that you believe that's a embodiment of the values that you believe. And so I always think it's a little bit anthropogenic or anthropocentric when people only think about humans as these special isolated ecosystems. In fact, after the human gut, or even maybe before the human gut, the soil is very rich microbial ecosystem, and in many ways follows the same principles of ecology that you find within the human gut. So an ecosystem is an ecosystem. Now the question is, where are you going to draw the line? And we have really interesting research programs that are looking at other hosts. So for example, the honeybee. We did 2 field trials on this and published the results of that in prominent papers, and won a lot of awards for our work in honeybees. And actually in this case, we found that a native organism in the hindgut of a honeybee is actually protective to the toxins that are present in human-induced pesticides. So especially these ones that are neonicotinoid pesticides. And so imagine this, when you're giving a honeybee an opportunity to drink water with glucose, its favorite food in the world, or water that's laced with a neonicotinoid pesticide. After a couple exposures, they start to go for the pesticide over the glucose. And this is very powerful stuff. This is starting to disorient the honeybee, and it's starting to completely change their behavior. So the work that we did there actually found an interesting detoxification response that can bind and eliminate these pesticides before they start to become centrally active within the honeybee. I think that this work is unbelievable. I'm super passionate about this stuff. The other project that we are announcing, or we announced recently, and now we're doing more research on, I think we're sequencing like 500 different coral samples right now, to see the effect from a highly promising paper that came out in Nature Microbiology. Actually, the Nature paper hasn't been published yet, but this is a Science Translational Medicine paper on coral. And it shows that when you actually look within coral that are exceptionally heat tolerant, and you transplant them into coral which are heat vulnerable, right? So the ones that the temperature changes in the water because of human-induced climate change are forcing the coral animal to expel its microorganisms, and then the coral bleaches and then the coral dies. And a reef can recover about two times maximum, but the average time to recovery is that you don't want to have one bleaching event more than any 15 or 20 years. Now we're starting to see it in about every 5 years in the same ecosystems. And after two, forget about it, they're gone. So we really like these projects that start to maybe reverse the effects that humans are having on the ecosystems around us and try to be a bit more optimistic to say, well, yeah, of course, if you could wave a magic wand and change behavior and stop all of these different activities, that's preferable. But in the meantime, ethically, I think we have a moral obligation to start to intervene using these cutting edge techniques that we have in this new field on areas where human impact on ecosystems is currently reversible, but pretty soon it's about to be past the point of return. And then, of course, when it comes to soil, we're deeply interested in how do you make plants grow with less water? How do you make plants grow with more nutrients? And then even some pretty far out there concepts we're working on right now is how do you actually make plants grow in environments that they don't really have any business growing in, that you could think about terraforming in deserts or in other planets. And so it keeps it fun. You know, I like to mix these human elements a little bit with what we call the work we're doing in what we're calling seed labs, which are these ecological applications of microbes for some of the most urgent things that we could intervene right now. And for this, we're collaborating with about 15 or 20 different academic groups all over the world.
No, this I find really exciting, and sort of, you know, it fits with this concept that I wrote about in my book, the One Health concept. Clearly, humans are so focused on their own health and on their gut health that they forget everything else that's been happening, or that is happening at the same time. That this human influence in the Anthropocene is really destroying ecosystems all over the place. You know, from the soil to the waters to wherever you look. I mean, it's just not an isolated event that happens in our gut and with our diet. And I always think that, you know, it will require a complete change in our mindsets, both the scientists, but also the politicians and the physicians, you know, to say, this is not just a human gut problem. You know, this is a universal problem, and microbes are one of the links that link this together. It's certainly not the only one, but I think, you know, microbiome ecology gives a really good viewpoint on what humans have been doing and what we can do to actually prevent this or slow it. I'm not sure if we can prevent what's going on, but, you know, to at least slow it.
Or even better is just to start to consider it. Even starting to understand it and even consider it and think about it, I think will go a long way. Again, a lot of these things, the best intervention would actually just be education to people, to live more mindfully, to accelerate the rate of development, clean development, so that other countries have the opportunity to develop the way that the West did, but without as much of an impact. You know, people really actually demonize, I don't even call them developing countries, I call them ascending countries now, but we forget that the US already did its polluting. We did it. We screwed up the oceans, we polluted, we had a bunch of emissions, and now we're on the other end of it. And so it's a bit, it's coming from a position of privilege to deny other people the opportunity to live in a developed world, just because we got there first, because we happened to get there at the end of a war when which we didn't really participate in until the very end, and everyone else is now licking their wounds. So yeah, it's a tough one. You know, you want to see development happen sustainably, but it's also very painful to go to places where you see so much plastic in the ocean that the fish are now starting to suffocate themselves, and it's very sobering to hear that. You know, it shows you how short term as a species we are as thinkers. When I tell someone that in 10 years, these are the four, there's a list. This isn't privileged information. You can go and see in 3 years, and 5 years, and 8 years, and 10 years, and 20 years, which animals will be extinct. You can see it. Some forecasts show that in about 20 years or 25 years, we're going to lose fish. it's you
Yeah,
can't hear that and then go back the next day and do the same thing, but that's what people do. And so it's a bit disappointing, you know. It's a bit sad, because I think that we really have a problem where education in and of itself doesn't. But at the same time, let's use the gut as an example. When someone has extreme gut distress, they're in pain, and when someone's in pain, they don't have the privilege of thinking about these environmental ecological issues. They just want to fix their pain. And so I think about it partially with sadness, but also with sympathy. And I don't know how it's going to play out on honestly. So it's a very hard topic to discuss.
I mean, talking about, so maybe, you know, we can close with this. So, you know, talking about privilege and talking about how different parts of the population, even in this country, you know, from the coastal areas to the inner cities, but also worldwide, the what do you call ascending countries, and, you know, the West. I mean, there's obviously, you know, huge difference in terms of what people pay attention to. Um, does Seed as a company, I mean, how much does Seed as a company address this? So, you know, now you go to there are one markets, the most upscale markets on the west side of Los Angeles, and that's where you know, we find Seed. You talk to people that are the most privileged on the west side, and they know about Seed. But do you have any plans to actually take that to other areas, even of the city or of the country, where people would benefit health-wise from these insights?
It's a big part of our mission. I mean, I think that the best place to make impact is in the cases of infection, right? Like, again, to have an optimal gut is, and I hate to say it, but is also even still a privilege, right? Like, it's not a life-threatening condition to have a gas after the consumption of a fiber-rich meal. I like that we have the science is at a place where we can offer things to improve quality of life in people that live a relatively hygiene rich, microbially derived type of lifestyle. These are the areas where these type of products actually have more or less the biggest impact. Like, you don't really see these types of problems in ascending countries, more or less, right? Like, you see clinical manifestations of a gastritis or of a gut infection or of inflammatory gut disorder, but you generally have far lower levels of non-specific IBS.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that it's part and parcel, they go together. So the solutions that might work in a Western gut might be very different than the things that need to be prioritized for a non-Western gut. When you look at different ecosystems, it starts to of the body, different ecologies within the body, it starts to become more interesting. So it's a huge disparity in what types of companies even get funded and what types of projects even get funded. I remember when we launched Luca Biologics, which is a company focused on women's health, focused on the vaginal microbiome, that we got a lot of pushback from the investment community when we wanted to prioritize bacterial vaginosis, because we said, look, we know what causes this. This has a dramatic effect on women's lives, on the quality of the life of people in the West. If they have discharge or odor, or they have the wrong microbes, it affects their confidence, it affects their ability to have a sexual partner. And sometimes it can happen from taking a course of antibiotics, or from a combination of a menstrual cycle and one more trigger that's completely out of their control, right? But we don't have any tools to fix this ecology. Well, we do. We just have to go through FDA trials before we're allowed to talk about it, which we're doing right now. And so we ignored what everybody said. We said, no, we said, why you don't want to prioritize this? Because we know the science is rock solid. And they said, because bacterial vaginosis predominantly affects inner city, uninsured patients that are not part of the payer system. And of course, there's a racial disparity here as well. And I think that that's really messed up. So we're financing all of this clinical FDA clinical trials, phase 2 FDA clinical trials, which historically have a multi-$100 million barrier to entry, to try to take this, to offer these products with the right claims at competitive costs that somebody who's uninsured can afford it. It's the same cost that you get from an over-the-counter medication, right? Or over-the-counter supplement. And this is kind of the when the walls break down you really have to take this opportunity to start to see what your value system is, what's part of your ethics, and then aggressively fight to defend it, because there's a lot of people that have their own interests, and you have to fight for the interests of what you think are best. Ultimately, that's what a company that I think has a good moral compass ends up doing. So we're doing this with bacterial vaginosis and preterm birth right now. It's a very similar study, similar situation with spontaneous preterm birth. This is the work of Dr. Jacques Ravel, a phenomenal scientist and a colleague probably of yours, someone who's very prominent in the scientific community. We're looking in applications of the gut-brain axis to work with people that have highly recalcitrant cases of non-specified anxiety and stress and disorder through the gut-brain axis. But again, these are long-term studies, and right now we're just in the middle phases of it. We're starting to validate the organisms in a controlled trial. I think that if you look at obesity, there's definitely an element of that which disproportionately affects people of lower socioeconomic income and that have a lower socioeconomic status. And part of it's education, part of it's nutritional input, but part of it's also the microbiome. So you want to build these therapies that are not designer drugs, but you want to build these therapies that are highly accessible. And by the way, every person that can afford that suffers from these areas, even with what the product we have on the market today, DSO1, that's mostly for digestive issues, we usually end up giving it to them when they write us. So we try with the limited resources we have today to try to make these things more accessible. But the visions is really a place that microbes can be this grand equalizer, right? That the microbes of, and by the way, there's people that are highly rich that can afford these interventions that have the absolute worst guts in the world and nothing works and they suffer consistently. And then there's people who are living on very little that have, actually, when you look at the readout, a gut that I would consider taking a rationally defined FMT from them. So there is an uneven distribution of microbes across the world that doesn't always cluster with socioeconomic status. And that part at least is very encouraging, that to have an optimal health actually requires very simple things, right? It requires the right access to basic nutritional inputs. It's something that you talk a lot about. It requires the resistance of a lot of these temptations of modern living, which are truly destructive. And it requires, I think, a reasonable amount of consideration to other biological processes that are highly protective. You think about your sleep, you think about your light exposure, and towards the end of the day, you think about your exercise and building a habit of exercise, the right type of exercise that builds structural integrity to the body. You start to think about the introduction of compounds that definitely support brain health. Yes, you could go pay $100 a month to get 3 grams of DHA essential fatty acids, or you could spend $1.30 to get wild, cold fished anchovies and sardines off the coast of Poland, anywhere in the world, with Amazon delivered to your door, and eat that every single day, and you'll get more DHA than you get from a supplement. So again, it comes back to how we make this, the importance of this. Usually what I found is the people who are suffering the most are the ones that have now built bad habits and can't undo it. And it's these temptations of bad diet, of lack of exercise. And believe it or not, I see these presentations far more in populations of affluence than I see in populations of scarcity.
I think this is a good way to end this conversation. We could go on for a long time. I mean, it was really fascinating, I have to say. Very different, very different approach to this from a commercial standpoint, to this field and to the challenges. Yeah, I mean, I can only hope that all the visions that SEED has will come to fruition and translate this into a fundamental change in the health and probably also medical field. So thanks a lot for the time you took. I really enjoyed it.
Thank you for hosting, Amran. Thank you for the space. Thank you for the scientific education, the work you do. And I think the nutrition side is really powerful. The take-home message I would say is, let's continue to find these pockets of information which can have the chance to scale, and keep trying to get this type of content out. So until next time, thank you for hosting.
Sounds good. Bye-bye. Take care.